All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and let's make sure we are hydrating. But I know y'all aren't using your voices as much as I am this week, but it is the night before APUSH, and this is our final big review on the channel. Okay, so let's hydrate real quick. Jug life. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get to it with some APUSH review. Now, I'm going to be live from 8 to 9, and then at 9, I'm going to be doing a broadcast with Fiveable. If you want more information about that, go to fiveable.me/plus, and if you decide to sign up for that, use the promo code TomRichey, all one word, but that's going to be at 9 o'clock. Also, at 10 o'clock, you'll see in the description, I've got a small group. It's capped at 25 people. It is a small group fireside chat. Which means that it's just me and a classroom-sized group of people. I'm answering questions. Note that I'm not recommending this for people on the East Coast. If you are on the East Coast, you need to go to bed. But some of the West Coast folks, people who are in other time zones, or some East Coasters are just going to insist on staying up. But I do want to note that I am not recommending that to East Coasters. Now, what I can recommend to everyone, ladies and gentlemen, is my Romulus APUSH review app. Now, let me make sure, just to be clear, this is a trivia app. A lot of times students have trouble. It's on the App Store, Google Play. It is just a trivia app. Okay, number 2, let's get it to number 1, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the questions are not stimulus-based, nor are they intended to be. This is for when you find yourself freezing on the DBQ, the LEQ, the SAQ, like what was the name of that again? I remember what that was. And this is just something that's a little handy review tool. Prepare now is one of our taglines, okay, that you can go anytime. Now, some people, they think they're going to find stimulus-based questions on an app. Like, why would I have stimulus-based questions on an app? That's kind of cumbersome. So anyway, we got a word from our sponsors, and I'm going to be taking questions primarily from Twitter at Tom Richey if you want to ask questions. Okay, the chat tends to move really, really fast with these things, and so I can't really take questions from the chat. Now, when I see super chats, I will try to address those. If you're asking for a shout out or you've got a question, I will try to address those, but there can be no guarantee on that. Okay, so I mean, if you do a super chat, it's a little bit at your own risk, but I will tell you that I'll be looking once in a while, and when I see super chats come in, I will try to address those. Okay, but mostly I'm going to be answering questions on Twitter unless I see a super chat. Okay, so with that, wow, that chat is going. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and go over to Twitter, and remember that our tagline for this exam season to identify ourselves as part of this community is "Let's get this bread." Somewhere on your DBQ, LEQ, even SAQ, whatever, just write "Let's get this bread," cross it out. That's what our community is doing, just as a little fun gag. Okay, so now also some people are doing some variants: yeet the wheat, finagle the bagel, obtain the grain, whatever works. Okay, yes, let's get this bread. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go over to Twitter at Tom Richey. I'm going to go over to Twitter, and we're going to see what the questions are looking like. All right, I am looking forward to this final review. Okay, it's going to be great. It's going to be. Can we still say lit? Can we still say lit? Now, what I'm learning is that I can say whoa. Okay, so at some point we might get to the treaty of whoa. Okay, some people say I have to put more sass in it. I'm working on it. And Romulus is also tweeting a few questions. Remember, I've got this Romulus app. You can kind of see some of the things that are coming up there. Okay, so with that, thank you so much, Mr. Dean's class. I want to make sure to shout out to Mr. Dean's class. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Dean, for your support, and all the teachers and students who are supporting my work, because it's really great. Okay, really great. Now, Emma is asking, can I explain Jacksonian democracy? Thank you. You're welcome, Emma. So what we want to think about Jacksonian democracy as far as kind of a big picture look at Jacksonian democracy. What we want to be thinking about is what were things like before and after, okay? So how is it that Jacksonian democracy is changing the face of American politics and society? And what we want to do is we want to go back to the Constitutional Convention and think about, like, what was the system of government that was instituted by the United States Constitution. And so you had the Senate and the House. And remember that the Senate was initially, before the 17th Amendment and the Progressive Era, that it was not directly elected by the voters. Instead, it was put there by state legislators. Okay, it was put there, or the state legislatures. Okay, so it was the state legislatures appointed the senators, and then the House was directly elected. And so what the framers were looking for here, okay, what the framers were looking for is that we need to have a government that has elements of aristocracy and democracy. Okay, so we don't want a pure democracy. Shout out to Francisco and Miss Middlebrook's class. Okay, super chatters over there. Shout out. Hopefully y'all do very well. I appreciate y'all's support. And so with that, we think about the Constitutional Convention, and we don't want a pure democracy. That's the founding generation. And in a lot of cases with that founding generation, voting was tied to owning property or being a part of the political class, that for people that own property, that the unpropertied masses don't need to vote. Okay, the unpropertied masses don't need to vote. And so that is the point of view of the framers. And so with Jacksonian democracy, what we see is as the United States starts moving west, you've got new states like Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky, that their constitutions are calling for universal manhood suffrage, or, that basically all of the white male inhabitants of this state will be able to vote regardless of whether they own property or not. And so that's the idea of Jacksonian democracy. It's the belief in the common man, and the idea that we don't need to, this person is ready to provide a hand in government. Now, Jackson kind of typifies this sort of thing. Thank you, Eclipse Mapping. Glad you appreciate my work. And so Jackson, of course, studied law and later became a planter, had a plantation, all of that kind of stuff. But he really came from nothing. I don't know if we're totally sure what state Jackson was even born in. Might have been born in my home state of South Carolina, but really kind of on the, on the frontier, so to speak. And so Jackson did not come from a background that was privileged at all. And so as far as that goes, we want to note where that's going. So now, and of course, we see a difference in the culture of politics. So when we think about, for example, this era of compromise, that compromise is like going back to the Constitutional Convention, the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. Then you go to the Missouri Compromise in 1820. These are compromises that are really like part of like aristocratic political culture. And so then when we start to see democratic political culture, remember, democracy is based on majority rule. Okay. And so when you think about that, something like, let's take the Missouri Compromise in 1820 before Jacksonian democracy, and then let's look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the Missouri Compromise, it's like Missouri wants to come in as a slave state. So Henry Clay's like, look, let's compromise here. And so Missouri can come in as a slave state. And then we're going to divide Massachusetts, which Maine had been part of Massachusetts. We'll let Maine come in as a free state so that we keep the balance between free states and slave states. And then we're going to draw a line on the Louisiana Purchase at 3630. And the territory north of 3630 in the Louisiana Purchase is that the Louisiana Purchase is going to be closed to slavery. And basically, Missouri can be an exception coming in as a slave state. And so this was something, the idea was that everybody can get together and compromise. Okay, so as far as that goes, everybody can get together and compromise. Whereas the Kansas-Nebraska Act, nullified really, or kind of, just canceled out the Missouri Compromise. And of course, Dred Scott, also made the Missouri Compromise technically unconstitutional in the eyes of the Supreme Court. But with that, when we look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's like, let's just roll back the Missouri Compromise and do Kansas and Nebraska on the model of popular sovereignty, even though the Missouri Compromise had already made that decision. Okay, so the Missouri Compromise had made this decision already, but we're going to go back because we've got a majority that supports this. And so democratic culture, I think, is very important in noting that. Now, also, you think about how the the meaning of the Constitution is changing for some people. Jefferson and Madison, their Constitution was based on a compact between the states. So sovereign states were entering together into an agreement. Whereas for Abraham Lincoln and Daniel Webster before him, that this is a nation, okay, that the United States is a nation, not just a confederation of sovereign states, and not, the Constitution is a national constitution and not the Articles on Crack or something like that, okay, or maybe steroids. Do I want to talk about the Constitution like it's on drugs? Probably not, right? Okay, so with that, going on, and let's see what we've got here. Look at some other questions. Oh my goodness, I think a super chat just disappeared right before I could get to it. My apologies. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and see what we've got with the next question here. And can I go over the Nixon administration? Basically, what's important other than Watergate? Okay, so Ashley Jones, good luck to you and your friends there. So let's talk about the Nixon administration. Now, the thing about Watergate is one of the funniest things about Watergate is in 1972, Nixon put together, I forget, was it a 48 or a 49 state victory? Anyway, a lot. Nixon achieved one of the biggest victories ever in a presidential campaign. There was never a presidential campaign where it was less necessary to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Now, how did Nixon engineer this massive victory in 1972? Okay, so let me look at 1972 presidential election. Now, for APUSH, it's not necessarily important, but I find myself thinking, was it a 48 or 49 state victory? Okay, I'm not quite sure. So I need to make sure, yes, that was a 49 state victory over George McGovern. Now, what happened is that Nixon was somebody that saw an opportunity, okay, because what was going on in the 1960s, where you had the civil rights movement going on there, you had, of course, the anti-war protest, the rise of the New Left, students for a Democratic Society, and other organizations, that Nixon started to speak to what he called the silent majority. Okay, so he wanted to speak to the silent majority, saying that I want to speak to those of you who are not hippies, who are not part of the New Left, you silent majority who are not out protesting. And Nixon, I don't know if I'd call Nixon a conservative, but he's at least kind of speaking to conservatives. And he saw an opportunity with his Southern strategy. Okay, so what Nixon did was he saw that, of course, the Democratic Party was losing its hold on the South, with its civil rights platform. And so Nixon appointed he tried to nominate a few judges to the Supreme Court who were from the South. They didn't get confirmed, but Nixon wanted to let white Southerners know that the Republican Party can be a good home for you. And that is something, his Southern strategy is something that really started to orient the South more toward the Republican Party. And only the elections in which Jimmy Carter, his first time around at least, and then Bill Clinton, these are the only times after Nixon that the Democratic Party has made meaningful inroads into the South, outside of maybe Virginia and Florida. And so with that, Nixon was instrumental there. Now, another thing about Nixon was the president who signed the EPA into law, the Environmental Protection Agency. And so this is in the late 60s and early 70s. The environmental movement is something that's happening, and Republicans weren't necessarily always hostile to that movement. So shout out to Jeff. Okay, Savage Carp Jr. wants to shout out to Jeff. Okay, so there we go. So those are a few things that I would note about Nixon other than Watergate. One more would be his foreign policy. Now, I've got a video on Richard Nixon's foreign policy where I go into a detailed, detailed analysis of his foreign policy. One of those things being the Nixon doctrine that, remember, this is after the Vietnam War, and Americans, a lot of Americans didn't like that we had made this massive troop commitment. It's not, let's see, so we've got Mr. Ludka's class. Okay, very good. All right, so with that, Nixon, when Americans are war weary with the full commitment to Vietnam, what we're dealing with here is that Nixon comes up with the Nixon doctrine. Okay, and so we see that we will send weapons and military equipment. We will send money to anybody that's fighting communism. We are glad to provide support to anyone who's fighting communism, but we are not going to send in troops. We are not going to send in military personnel because Americans are war weary. And in Vietnam, for example, that is what we call Vietnamization. Vietnamization. And so that's basically let the South Vietnamese fight their own war. Okay, so let the South Vietnamese fight their own war. So a few things about Nixon, because I know we typically know him from Watergate. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and go to some others here. The Embargo Act and the War of 1812. Oh, this cursed grabbed me. All right, Mr. Goldman's APUSH class. Okay, so thank you, Mr. Goldman's APUSH class, for your support. So happy to see y'all here. All right, so with that, now anytime I think of the embargo, I think of that cartoon, with the snapping turtle. And it's like, oh, this cursed grabbed me. Because the snapping turtle's like biting that guy in the butt. And Jefferson's embargo. Okay, so what happens here is the context of the embargo was the War of 18. No, that can't happen yet, right? Because that's causing that. The context of the embargo was during the Napoleonic Wars. The British blockaded the European continent, and they started to board American ships. Now, the Royal Navy wasn't paying as well as the American Navy at that time. And to be quite frank, there probably were some British who had deserted who were getting onto American ships. But it does not excuse that the British started boarding American ships and taking sailors off of that ship and pressing them into service. This is what's known as impressment. So the impressment of American sailors, and also the British were not allowing American ships to trade with Europe. And then you've got another illustrative example would be the Chesapeake Leopard affair. The Chesapeake Leopard affair, in which the HMS Leopard fired upon the Chesapeake within sight of the coast, of the American coast, basically in our territorial waters, that a British ship fired upon an American ship. And so Jefferson, now, of course, we also want to note here, kind of the irony of Jefferson is that as Secretary of State, Jefferson wasn't necessarily a big fan of Washington's neutrality proclamation. But when Jefferson took office, he committed himself to the policy of neutrality. And so Jefferson was trying very hard to keep the United States out of this European war. And also, he knew that does the United States really want a war with Britain? Are we ready for a war with Britain? Not so much. And so Jefferson decides, in order to try to keep the United States out, let's try the embargo. Now, the thing about this is, while technically constitutional, it was a bit of a stretch of Jefferson's principles, because Jefferson did not believe in economic coercion. And so what happened here is Jefferson just said, we're not going to trade with anybody. Now, the Embargo Act was then, you don't necessarily need to know the names of the successor acts like Macon's Bill number 2. I can't even tell you exactly what it did, but there are some others like the Non-Intercourse Act, Macon's Bill number 2. If you don't remember those, it's okay, but just note that the Embargo Act was taken off, it was kind of like tapered down a little bit. So the embargo was, but the thing is, Jefferson always blamed New Englanders, especially for trying to smuggle things out. Okay, that they weren't not everybody was on the same page with the embargo, but the embargo was a failure. And by 1812, it was becoming apparent to a lot of people, especially this younger generation. Now, this is when Clay and Calhoun were very young, and they were two leaders of the so-called, what we call them in hindsight, war hawks. Remember, a hawk is anyone who is hawkish, anyone who is a fan of war as an instrument of policy. And so with that, we see that there is some push here that Madison originally tried to stick with the embargo. I mean, 1812 is in Madison's 4th year of his term, of his first term. And so Madison finally, caves to some pressure. Now, the Battle of Tippecanoe is another causal factor. So we think about, like, in the Atlantic Ocean, the British are cutting off our trade. Okay, the British are cutting off our trade. And then let me go ahead and pull this up. Okay, I don't think it would be a bad idea to pull this up here. Okay, so let me go ahead and run into here. All right, so I've got that pulled up, and let's just take a quick look at Madison's war message. And so the Battle of Tippecanoe, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so with that, okay, let me go ahead and all right. Okay. So, y'all notice that when I screen share, all of a sudden it's like, okay, app plug. Remember, Romulus APUSH review is available for $2.99 at the App Store and Google Play. Currently #2 on the App Store. Let's see if we can get it to #1, ladies and gentlemen. Just to be clear, it's a trivia app. It's trying to help you, trying to help you get that trivial knowledge in your head so that you're not stuck when you're writing an LEQ. Okay, that you're remembering what stuff is called and you're not struggling. And so the Battle of Tippecanoe, that's when William Henry Harrison, who would later be president of the United States for like a month until he died, defeated a force that was allied with Tecumseh, who was an Indian leader in today what is the Midwest. This happened, Indiana, Illinois, what was then the Indiana Territory. So as far as that goes, that the British, British. Okay. All right. It's late. Okay. Or it's not late, but I've been broadcasting a lot this week. So forgive my tongue ties and such. Now, what the Indians were using in the Battle of Tippecanoe, they were using, muskets that were made in Canada. And so, with that, this is what happens. A lot of people said, well, you know what? It's the British are intentionally arming the Indians against us. And so that's when you see the war hawks. They start to become even more incensed. And finally, Madison's war message in June of 1812 is that basically lays out the provocations. So in the seas, the impressment of sailors and the cutting off of our trade. So those are two things. And the third is the incitement of Indians on the western frontier. Now, how actively the British are doing this, I'm not able to tell you, but this is certainly something that a lot of Americans were thinking this is a problem, the incitement of these Indians on the western frontier. And so that's leading to the War of 1812. Now, of course, this was not a very popular war in the Northeast. And what you see is a fusion. You see that anti-Madison Republicans in New York are voting with New England here. Now, the battle, as far as the military campaigns, this wasn't a very good war for the United States. The Capitol was burned by the British. Thank you, Dolly Madison, for saving the iconic portrait of George Washington. That was very nice of her to do that. But a few things. Now, you had the Battle of Fort McHenry, where we got the Star-Spangled Banner. But, the war didn't really go that well for the United States for the most part. But it went well enough to where we weren't, beaten. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814, what happened was that they agreed to status quo antebellum, that they restored things to the way they were before the war. Now, when we think antebellum, remember that is also what we call the period before the Civil War, the period from 1820 to 1860, starting with the Missouri Compromise and, of course, ending with the secession of the Deep South in late 1860, early 1861. So status quo antebellum. Now, this is before the transatlantic telegraph or anything like that. So while that was going on, there was the Hartford Convention. They didn't realize that the war was over. So there were delegates from several New England states that got together and they proposed amendments to the Constitution, which at face value are reasonable. I think that something like if we're going to have an embargo, 2/3 of each house. If we're going to declare war or admit new states, 2/3 of each house. We should have some consensus here. An amendment against conscription, which, of course, during the War of 1812, conscription was debated. Okay, conscription was debated, but it never went into effect. Remember that there are 4 times we have conscription in U.S. history. The 2 in the middle are the World Wars. Okay, so the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. So there was no conscription during the War of 1812, but it was debated. The Madison administration was supporting a bill for that. Okay, so with that, we want to know that the Hartford Convention is happening, but at the same time, it is something that the Treaty of Ghent has already been signed. Now, the other side of that, is the other side of that, going from there, let's see, let me share my screen again with you. we want to note that the other side of that, what really kills the Federalist Party, okay, is that the what they do here, and this is these New England Federalists are getting together, and they say that resolved that if the application of these states to the government in the United States recommended in a foregoing resolution should be unsuccessful and peace should not be concluded, and the defense of these states should be neglected as it has been since the commencement of the war, it will in the opinion of this convention be expedient for the legislatures of the several states to appoint delegates to another convention to meet in Boston in the state of Massachusetts on the third Thursday of June next, with such powers and instructions as the exigency of a crisis so momentous may require. Secession. Okay, so basically they're kind of whispering. It's kind of what we might call a dog whistle for secession, that we'll get together in 6 months and we'll take whatever measures might become necessary for that. So with that, that after the Battle of New Orleans, okay, the Battle of New Orleans, we tend to remember the beginning of something and the end of something. So the War of 1812 ended with the Battle of New Orleans, and the Battle of New Orleans was an overwhelming victory for Jackson and his army against the British. The British just did a frontal assault against a fortified position and were clobbered. And so with that, there was this like rise of patriotic sentiment. Why are you getting so sentimental, Sav? A lot of people were getting sentimental. All of the patriotic sentiment happening here. So with that, the Hartford Convention, that's right. The Hartford Convention was a fat oof, okay? Because then the Hartford Convention delegates are coming to Washington, and then it's like, oh, the war's over. And the war ended really well with the Battle of New Orleans. And so the Federalist Party is done, okay? The thing about the legacy of the War of 1812 is the Federalist Party is done, at least officially, okay? Because there's actually a punchline here when you think about it, okay? Because first of all, so we remember this is the end of the first party system, okay? So the War of 1812 killed the Federalist Party due to the Federalist Party's association with the Hartford Convention, okay, and the perception the Federalists were contemplating secession. But, okay, we give him some 8-bit shades there. The idea of a purely agricultural economy was no longer viable after the War of 1812. Before the War of 1812, what the economy was based on largely, and this is what I call the Jeffersonian economic model, okay, which I think I've got it somewhere in here. If I scroll, actually, you know what? Maybe I don't have the Jeffersonian economic model in here, but let's go ahead. We want to note here, I've got a presentation about Henry Clay's American system. Okay, so let's make this clear. Okay, so the Jeffersonian economic model is this model where it is based on agriculture and trade. Remember that Jefferson wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia that we don't want any manufacturing in the United States. And so the United States should export raw materials and should import finished goods, much like they did during colonial times, but on a basis of free trade. And so the intervening event here, the War of 1812, what happens when Europeans start killing each other and we can't trade with Europe? And so that's when Henry Clay, after the War of 1812, even though the Federalist Party is not technically in existence anymore, the Federalist Party, their ideas enter the Republican Party. So Henry Clay's American system, NIP, okay? The way I remember it, NIP, you could say PEN, but the only problem with PEN is you don't know if it's PEN or PIN. So the American system, a national bank, which the first bank of the United States had expired in 1811. He wants to bring back the national bank. And he actually does bring that back in 1816. Internal improvements such as infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, and then finally a protective tariff to support domestic manufacturing. And Henry Clay, does get the American system to an extent. The second national bank, the second bank of the United States, is chartered in 1816, and the tariff of 1816, which was the first like properly protective tariff passed in U.S. history. And what's happening here is now internal improvements. Madison vetoed Calhoun's bonus bill. So that was something Madison, made some concessions after the War of 1812 to lose constructionism, because he felt, we've got this war debt and we've got to modernize our economy a little bit. But at the same time, Madison did, on his way out the door, reassert strict constructionism when he vetoed the bonus bill and said that internal improvements are not in the Constitution. And so with that, note that the War of 1812 did put the United States on the road to an industrial economy. But what we want to remember is the idea of continuity and change over time. Okay, not just change over time, but also continuity and change. And so with that, we're looking at, during the antebellum period, for example, especially with the advent of the cotton gin, that cotton agriculture is going to be the most profitable sector of the U.S. economy in the antebellum period. All right, alrighty then. So with that, let's see what we've got coming around the bend there. All right. So with that, okay, so we go to the next question. Let's go ahead and look on Twitter, and let's see. So let's see, where are we going there? Okay, let's see. We've got Annabella Maria using the Romulus app. Very good. Remember, the Romulus APUSH review app Romulus APUSH review app is available at the App Store and Google Play. Oh, that's so funny. People are looking at Hannah's timeline of APUSH. Somebody wanted a physical copy of this thing she put on Twitter. Okay. Now, as far as that, Hannah, can I go over the Clinton presidency? I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Okay. Now, the thing is, what I want to say here is that the Clinton presidency, it's one thing you want to note is post 1980 only makes up about 5% of the exam. And when you consider that it's really like a lot of what I've seen goes into like Reaganomics and that sort of thing. Now, we do want to note one thing that I can tell you about Bill Clinton is that the Democrats, once again, like the Democrats for years had a problem where they were putting up nominees who were too far left. And then they decided, okay, well, let's find a Southern Democrat who's got a reputation for being a moderate. And so Bill Clinton had this reputation for being a moderate. And of course, Al Gore at the time, too. They were both Southern Democrats. And so the Democratic Party was able to, through this, more moderate president. Now, Clinton, a couple things here that, he did, he tried healthcare reform, didn't work, wasn't able to get that through Congress. Now, what he was able to get through Congress, and this is kind of the irony of this, is that Clinton ended up being the one that passed legislation that Reagan would have loved to have passed. So when Clinton signed the welfare reform bill, like the Republicans took Congress in 1994, and so Clinton actually took in a Republican political advisor, Dick Morris, and then kind of recalibrated. And so Clinton, actually worked with Republicans in Congress to put a welfare reform bill, into law. And so Clinton, the Democrat, is the one who signed this welfare reform bill. So with Clinton, we're looking at an era of Democratic centrism in the Democratic Party. And so with that, we go into, let's see what else we've got here. Okay. Now, what I think would be more useful, Yanni, is remembering remembering a comparison, not so much between like the Gilded Age and the 1820s, as much as the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Now, during the Gilded Age, one misunderstanding that a lot of people have is that the Gilded Age is, was a time of laissez-faire by the government. And the thing is when you think about it, are you going to be able to support that with evidence? Because what you've got to consider is that, when you think about laissez-faire, the government's just kind of sitting aside. And when we look at the Pacific Railroad Act, where the government provided subsidies to help build the railroads, then that's not laissez-faire. Okay, that's not laissez-faire. When the government is intervening in the case of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 or the Pullman Strike, both times on the side of big business against the labor laborers, then that is not laissez-faire. So there are a lot, and also the high protective tariff. That was not laissez-faire. So the United States government was, was constantly seen as always providing like support for big business. Now, bosses of the Senate. Let me show you this cartoon from the Gilded Age. If we look here, the bosses of the Senate. Let me find a good version of this, and let's see what Jesse's Cafe has for us. This website here. Okay, we've got a good one here. Let me show you this. And ladies and gentlemen, remember in the description, there is a link to my fireside chat, which starts at 10 p.m. Eastern. Now, remember, if you're in the Eastern time zone, go to bed. But those of you who are in other time zones, you might be interested in that review session, which is limited to 25 people. I'm going to be basically with a small group of people answering questions. Okay, so with this, the bosses of the Senate, and you can see here where the monopolists get to come in, and we have this look where the government is seen as dominated, which it was, seen as dominated by big business, okay? Dominated by all of the trust, these boards that oversaw several companies so that they're not competing with each other, that when you see all the little senators, and of course here, the people's entrance is closed, okay? This is a Senate of the monopolist, for the monopolist, by the monopolist. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, Romulus AP US History Review. Let's see. Still number 2 in education. Hopefully, we'll get it to number 1 tonight, ladies and gentlemen. So, with that, during the Gilded Age, you've got government support for big business, and as a result, there's public outcry. Now, during the Gilded Age, there was, of course, the Sherman Antitrust Act, but it wasn't a very strong piece of legislation. Okay, that it was one of those things that, okay, Congress needs to pass an antitrust act, so let's pass a weak antitrust act. Now, during the progressive era, we see something different here, okay? During the progressive era, what we end up seeing is that instead of government regulation of business, now the causation here in the context would be the popular outcry. We want a government that is not in the pocket of big business. So from there, what you get into the progressive era, and you have government regulation of business, okay? Rather than government support for big business, you've got government regulation of business. And so with that, we see that with the regulation of business, one example of this would be, when you see that Teddy Roosevelt with the anthracite coal strike, okay? So in 1902, when there's a strike, rather than do like his predecessors and intervene on the side, rather than do like his predecessors and intervene on the side of big business all the time, what he did here was he invited the business leaders and the labor leaders to come to the White House, and he mediated the strike. Now, also, Teddy Roosevelt, was president when the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, when those pieces of legislation were passed, which regulated business. And really, the progressive era, you are entering into another type of, mindset that now it's based on the government regulating business, not the government supporting business all the time. And the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was passed during the Wilson administration, that was an antitrust act that actually had teeth, and that antitrust act also exempted labor unions specifically. Okay, so with this, let me thank Katie Hall 22, Julia M. Wolter, XXLBX_AV, and Max Bergman for Instagram follows. I'm also at Tom Richey on Instagram. I'll try to do another Instagram shout out before this is all said and done. Okay, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, moving on to let's see if we can get another question in here. All righty then. Okay, we got a lot of people here. Great to see all of you. And so, are people being mean to me in the chat? Somebody said stop being mean to Tom in the chat. All right. So as far as that goes, all right. So with that, I tell you, the chat is moving so fast here. All right. So going on from there, let's go back to Twitter and see where we've got another, another question coming in. Okay. And let's see, we got some more notifications here. All right. So then can I go over let's see, Reconstruction. Okay. So Jessica, shout out to Jacobson's class. Okay. So we want to make sure to shout out to Jacobson's class. So thank you so much, Jacobson's class, for your support. Now, Reconstruction, what we want to remember, the main thing is when you've got a large thing going on like that, is that we want to subdivide it. The biggest thing here is to subdivide presidential reconstruction and radical reconstruction. Can I tell Mr. Radke to let, I don't know what I can tell Mr. Radke, but I am going to say hello to Mr. Radke. So as far as that goes, presidential reconstruction. Now, this has its roots in the Civil War. What we need to remember here is that that Abraham Lincoln was fighting the Civil War always to preserve the Union. Now, with the Emancipation Proclamation and going from there, with the 13th Amendment, Abraham Lincoln did commit to emancipation, to getting rid of slavery. Okay, so when I think about presidential reconstruction, preserve the Union and eradicate slavery, okay, emancipate slaves. And so we see the 10% plan that Lincoln, remember, in his mind, the South had never really left the Union. And so with that, you can't secede. And so let's bring these states back in the Union because these Confederate governments were never legitimate. And so with that, we're getting into the, with presidential reconstruction in terms of what are the goals here. So preserve the Union, emancipate slaves. Remember the 13th Amendment. I always ask students, what did the 13th Amendment do? Okay. And so obviously the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Then what else did the 13th Amendment do? Well, what else did the 13th Amendment do? You think about it. What else did it do? What else did it do? Yeah, nothing. It's a trick question. All the 13th Amendment did was abolish slavery. That's it. That is all the 13th Amendment did, was abolish slavery. And so beyond that, that was Lincoln's goal, abolish slavery and leave it otherwise to the states. Now, Dred Scott, according to Dred Scott, African Americans couldn't be citizens. And so the law of the land was, it was very nebulous. What is the status of the freed men and women? And so Lincoln said in his last speech, personally, I'd like to see the more intelligent ones, as he called it, vote. And he said that I would like to see the veterans vote, but he said he wasn't going to make that a condition for Reconstruction, was not going to make a condition for Reconstruction. And so with Lincoln, preserve the Union, emancipate slaves. Please say Donald Bartlett Nene. Okay, great. So with that, can I please shout out to your boy, Ron? Also, could you shout out to the Bistro Businessman? Okay, so glad for that. And shout out to my friend Jordan Davidson and all of my friends out in Ocala, Florida. So happy that you're watching. So thank you so much for that. So now radical reconstruction. Now, Lincoln was a Republican, but he was more of a moderate Republican, which if we think about in today's politics, not every Republican is necessarily a big fan of President Trump, for example. And so not every Republican was a fan of Lincoln. And so with that, Lincoln, as far as that goes, that the radical Republicans, they wanted to go further than Lincoln, and they wanted to, punish the former Confederate states, treat them as conquered provinces rather than try to preserve the Union. And then they wanted full citizenship and voting rights for African Americans in the South. Now, with that, there's a high road and a low road. Okay, so were the radical Republicans concerned about equal rights for African Americans? Possibly so. Did the radical Republicans benefit politically from enfranchised African Americans in the South? Definitely. Okay, so with that, though, that radical reconstruction put the, after Lincoln's assassination, and Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, so he wasn't even part of their party, that the radical Republicans after 1866 were able to take control of Reconstruction. So radical or congressional Reconstruction was giving the South harsher terms and also making sure that African Americans were citizens. And so that's where you go to the 14th Amendment that has birthright citizenship. It says that everybody who is born in the United States is, and subject to its laws, is a citizen of the United States. And then everyone is, no state shall do anything to interfere with due process or keep any citizen from having the equal protection of the laws. Okay. So when we look at the 14th Amendment, we see also some things to punish the Confederacy. So it basically cancels out all Confederate debt. Anybody who gave money to the Confederacy, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Some Confederate leaders are disenfranchised and held ineligible for office by the 14th Amendment. And so then the 15th Amendment, voting rights, or at least not necessarily voting rights. Somebody mentioned that our Constitution never really asserts the right to vote per se, but it basically just gives a list of things that you can't deny somebody the right to vote for. And so with that, the 15th Amendment said that you can't deny somebody's right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so with that, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so going from there, the radical Republicans, they weren't just trying to preserve the Union, okay? They wanted to basically remake the South and, create what they believed would be a permanent Republican majority. Now, that's not from me. That's from a speech from Thaddeus Stevens, who said that he wanted to see the perpetual ascendancy of what he called the Party of the Union, the Republican Party. Okay, so let's see what we can find out there, and let me run over to Instagram and see if we can do a few shout outs there. Okay, so thank you, Dakota B0, Catherine Norton. We've got Holly DeCordo, Martin Ponce, Kaylee, Casey, Sophie, Cool Brobin, Casey VL. We've got Christian. Then we've got Grace, Floor, Watt _memes. All right, JV fan, and Abby, and then we've got Miss Amaruso. Okay, Miss Amaruso, who is she a miss yet? I don't know, but as far as that goes, I don't know if that's a teacher or a student. So Horn Danovan and Seth Martin, thank y'all so much, and also A Day at the Race and Ryan Larson with 2 N's. All right, so thank y'all very much, and Sam Reitman. All right, so let's go ahead and see if we can get another question in. Now, remember, I'm about to head over to Fiveable for a review that I think Fiveable Plus is like $5 a month, and if you put in the code Tom Richey, it's $4. Now, that's not for me. That's just something I'm doing with another company that I'm leading the review with. Now, if you don't want monthly membership, then make sure that you cancel that after tonight's session, that you don't let it recur billing or whatever. But as far as that goes, I'll be going over to Fiveable at 9. And remember, I'm hosting a fireside chat at 10, and I would not recommend that to my friends on the East Coast. If you're on the East Coast, it's really getting about time to go to bed. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and take a look there. We still have a few spots in the fireside chat, but I'm looking forward to getting together with a small group of people. All right, and shout out to Miss Martin's Strive for 5 gang. Okay, so Sarah and your friends, hope y'all have a great time tomorrow on the exam. All right. So going from there, can I go over the Spanish-American War, please? Shout out to Dr. Killa's class. And so, Kat, hopefully you do very well in the exam. And also Mr. Lewis, Mr. Cook from Poway High. All right, so we already went into Gilded Age a little bit, but with that, Miss Kimmerer's period 7. Okay, so we got a few people wanting some shout outs. That's awesome. So the Spanish-American War is really a turning point in U.S. history, like 1898. 1898 is a year that I would urge you to remember, because this is the year that the United States annexed Hawaii and the year that the United States, fought the Spanish-American War, which was a very quick war, what some people called a splendid little war, that it was very lopsided. Okay, the United States won overwhelmingly, but what happened here is this is a turning point, because along with the annexation of Hawaii, now we see that, now we see with the annexation of Hawaii, the Spanish-American War. After the Spanish-American War, we gave Spain some money, and then Spain freed Cuba. Okay, because remember, the context of the Spanish-American War was the explosion of the USS Maine. Remember yellow journalism as a causal factor in the Spanish-American War. Yellow journalism as a causal factor. And so with that, the USS Maine, and there's a popular outcry for war. Now, after the war, we give Spain some money. Spain frees Cuba, which means that Cuba is now going to be under U.S. dominance. And then the United States gets Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Now, the people in the Philippines had been fighting for their independence while they were part of Spain. And then the United States comes in and starts fighting against the Filipino revolutionaries. Which you wonder, what is the United States of America doing fighting against people who are fighting for their freedom? And you see the founding of the American Anti-Imperialist League. And the Anti-Imperialist League included a lot of people you might know, such as Mark Twain, also Andrew Carnegie, also included William Graham Sumner. Okay, William Graham Sumner he gave a speech. Okay, he's a professor at Yale, and he gave a speech entitled "The Conquest of the United States by Spain." And he's saying here, of course, ironically titling this, that maybe the United States won the war, but did we retain our values? And remember, this goes back to kind of the Jefferson versus Hamilton thing. That is American greatness measured by how rich we are, or how powerful our country is, or how strong our military is? Or is it measured by how free we are? And so William Graham Sumner's writing about, hey, we might have won that war, but in the course of this, we have lost something. We have lost our freedom. We should not we should not be, we should not be stopping other people from gaining their independence. Now, William Graham Sumner was also a social Darwinist. A lot of people cite social Darwinism as a justification for imperialism, but at the same time, social Darwinism can also be an anti-imperialist philosophy because it focuses on the principle of non-intervention. And so not intervening in a situation where there are developing countries, like in the course of their development, kind of like if any of you watch Star Trek, General Order 1 or the Prime Directive. That is rooted in social Darwinist principles of non-intervention and allowing that society to freely develop. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to conclude this broadcast, and which I've got a few other things going on after this. I tell you, the way that this exam schedule has worked out this time, I'm sorry I haven't been able to do more broadcasts for APUSH, but they put AP Euro on Wednesday and APUSH on Friday. So it's just I was only able to pivot to APUSH for a few days, and I wish there were more that we could have done. But I very much appreciate y'all coming out tonight. And remember that I'm heading over to Fiveable. Go to fiveable.me/plus if you want to join me there. And also we've got the fireside chat at 10 p.m. Eastern, really more recommended for people in the western half of the country that still have some study time going on there. Okay, so as far as that goes, remember that we've got the Romulus APUS History Review app on the App Store and Google Play, only $2.99. And let me be clear about what it is. Some people buy it not really realizing what it is. It's a trivia app. It's not for stimulus-based questions. It's for reinforcing trivial knowledge, and you can go into any topic. You can say, I want to get some trivia about the Constitution or European colonizers, remembering like which ones were Catholic, which ones evangelized the Indians, maybe some things on the American Revolution or the age of Jackson. So for $2.99, this is just a nice little thing that also when you're on your way to the AP test, not while you're driving, but if you're riding or you're waiting before you turn in your phone, this is a nice, a nice tool just to kind of remind you like, oh, okay, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts. In response. Well, wait, never mind. That's a bad screen there. Need to fix that. Okay, if any of my partners are watching, make sure that we fix that. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we need to go ahead and, call it a night. And I'm about to head over to Fiveable, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of y'all in the fireside chat. And it has been a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. And remember, tomorrow, if you want to identify yourself with our community and just a little gag, let's get this bread. Make sure you cross it out so that it doesn't count on your essay. So it is always a pleasure. And I look forward to working with some of you next year if you're taking AP Euro or AP Gov. Good luck tomorrow, everyone.